So welcome to this second part of lecture 2 on normative ethical theories. So today we have been talking about, moral decision making and how we can decide upon the morality of an action. In the first part I discussed the trolley problem to get your intuition going a bit, right? Can we save one person and at the expense of one, or should we not sacrifice one person? And we're going in the second part of the lecture talk a bit about moral relativism and moral absolutism. And these are two main categories if we think about principles that might guide our decision making and our moral judgments, the evaluation that we make of our moral acts. We of course wonder, well, what kind of principles actually emerge and how can we decide whether an action is actually morally right or morally wrong? Well, we can use normative ethical theories to analyze the rightness or the moral justness of an action. And I ended the previous or the first part of today's lecture with introducing you to utilitarianism, Kant's ethics of duty, and I also mentioned that there might be some other principles that we let our decision-making guide. So we can actually categorize these three different flavors, right? So utilitarianism, ethics of duty, or some other kind of principle in two categories where on the one hand we differentiate between ethical relativism, and on the other hand, we position ethical absolutism. And it's already a bit in these two names of these different views, right? Relativism versus absolutism, that gives away what these two views are actually about. So ethical relativism is the view that morality is subjective and context dependent, right? So you might ask someone about this trolley problem. One person will say, well, it's okay to sacrifice 5 people. And another one might say, we should actually save those 5 people at the expense of one person. This will be subjective. We cannot really differentiate between these two positions according to an ethical relativist because morality is subjective, right? So it's in the eye of the beholder. What I think is probably different than what you think, and both of our positions are good, equally well off. They also say that it's context dependent, right? So geographically, but also think about time. So over time, morality will differ, and we cannot really compare these different perspectives across time or context. Ethical absolutism, on the other hand, is a totally different perspective because there they would claim that there are eternal, universally applicable moral principles. So irrespective of the position you hold, where you live, in which time you live, in what kind of family you grew up, whether you have had a good upbringing or a bad, doesn't really matter. There are moral rules, sort of laws, you might say, that guide our, or should guide our moral decision making. These theories that I already discussed very briefly in the first part of this lecture, think of utilitarianism and ethics of duty, are actually two theories that are positioned under this umbrella of ethical absolutism, right? So there is one, in each of these two theories, there is a principle that is always applicable, irrespective of when you lived and where you are living. We're going to discuss these two theories in part 3 and part 4 of today's lecture. But for now, I would really like to go into the position of ethical relativism, explain a bit more what this is about, but also discuss some of the pitfalls of this theory. So here on the slide, you see a argument that from an ethical relativist point of view is actually valid, right? So it writes, or read with me, Alice believes that eating beef is right. Bob, on the other hand, believes that eating beef is wrong. And then the conclusion would be, if we agree that ethical relativism is correct, that there is no fact of the matter about whether eating beef is right or wrong. So we cannot actually draw a conclusion as to whether eating beef is right or wrong, because it's subjective, right? So for an ethical relativist, both Alice and Bob are actually correct, right? They are um, they are right to make their own claims about eating beef, and we cannot really differentiate between these two positions. So I know that many people would claim that they are actually an ethical relativist, right? So the idea that you cannot do some things in some context, but in other contexts they might be right. I think that's a very intuitively appealing position to many people. But the argument on the slide also illustrates that there are some problems with this, right? So because how can we actually determine whether something is right or wrong if we cannot really objectively pin down when something is right or wrong? So I'm very curious to hear, if this would have been possible, whether you would be convinced by this argument. But of course, unfortunately, we cannot really discuss this now. But think a bit about it, and maybe it's an interesting point of discussion in next tutorial. So just to give another example and to also show you a bit more explicitly that this argument we just saw on the previous slide about eating beef, that is actually a very absurd way of reasoning, is to show you that if we would take another example, namely the height of the Martini Tower, and I'm sure that all of you know what I'm talking about, or the tower in the market at the marketplace in Groningen, there could be different opinions about the size, the height of the Martini Tower. So again, Alice and Bob, and it's the same setup in terms of the argument, but now rather than having opinions about eating beef, we're going to insert opinions about the Martini Tower, right? So Alice believes that the Martini Tower is 127 meters tall. Bob believes that the Martini Tower is 86 meters tall. Well, from an ethical relativist point of view, now the conclusion should be that we cannot decide anything about the height of the Martini Tower, right? We know that both Alice and Bob, from an ethical relativist point of view, have a subjective claim to the truth. But this is of course absurd, right? We can measure the Martini Tower, and if we were to do that, we would know that it's 97 meters tall. So this is just to signal a bit, or to show you that maybe for moral positions, you can of course say, well, I'm sure you are right, I hold a different perspective, and whether your opinion is morally right or mine, we agree to disagree, right? That would be an ethical relativist point of view. But these arguments are also a bit flawed, right? So let me show you some other problems with ethical relativism. So if ethical relativism were true, it would become very difficult to criticize others for their moral beliefs, because that would be like criticizing others for their tastes. So on the slide you see two pictures. And of course, imagine we're going to get an ice cream and I choose as two flavors, I don't know, let me come up with a very odd combination of flavors. Mint going together with pistache. Probably there's some people that really like these tastes going together, but or maybe I would really like it, but I could very much imagine that you would be a bit doubtful about my choice, right? However, if we are both ethical relativists, then we would be fine having both our particular taste for ice cream, right? And we could not really criticize each other for that. And with ice cream, there isn't really a problem there, right? I don't really care what kind of ice cream you choose. Now, on the other picture, there is a human rights picture of a Egyptian prison. And there, actually, the circumstances of the prisoners are very poor. People are treated really badly. And this, at least from a Western perspective, would not be well, right to treat people in this way, even though they are prisoners. Now, from an ethical relativist point of view, we could not really criticize this, right? Remember that ethical relativism proposes that morality is context dependent and subjective, right? So how can we actually compare prisons in Egypt and in the Netherlands? And how can we actually have an opinion about the situation in an Egyptian prison? From an ethical relativist point of view, that's something that you cannot criticize because we should take the context, etc., into account. Another example. Imagine that if ethical relativism were true, then one could find out what is right or wrong by observing what people in a certain culture believe about right and wrong. Ethical relativism proposes that morality is subjective and context dependent. So that would also mean that if you were to go to a faraway country and you observe how people treat each other there, what they value, what they believe, then that should give you an indication about the things they think are right and wrong. But of course, there are people that live in very poor circumstances. Think also of this Egyptian prison that I just showed you. And also the boy on the picture is very illustrative. There is, I would say, an absolute truth or an absolute ethical verdict that we could give of child labor, namely that that is something that is ethically wrong. And I'm sure that most of you would agree with me if I would reach that conclusion. Another example. If ethical relativism were true, it would not make sense to talk about moral progress. This is actually the final problem with ethical relativism that I want to share with you. Because remember, ethical relativism is subjective and context dependent. And that also means that we cannot really compare situations over time. And here on the picture you see a statue of Aletta Jacobs. To some she might be familiar. And Aletta Jacobs was the first woman, Dutch woman, that started a study in higher education in 1870. 1 year later, in 1871, she started at the University of Groningen, where she studied to become a doctor. Now, Aletta Jacobs was one of the first initiators of the first feminist wave that fought for women's rights in the Netherlands. Well, I think that most of you would agree that this really is an example of moral progress, a situation where women in the Netherlands in the 19th century did not have any rights. They could not go to university, they could not vote, they could not divorce their husbands, etc. But due to the efforts of, well, Aletta Jacobs and many others, at some point women were allowed to study, they were allowed to vote, they could attend to their own finances, etc. Right? So there is definitely a development, and you could, I think, make a claim that morality has improved over time. And I'm sure that most of you would agree with me. From an ethical relativist point of view, however, this is something that you cannot do, right? Context change, and there is no universal principle that we can use to make the comparison. One more example before I actually want to end this second part of today's lecture is an example of relativism in business. And this is an example of Heineken of a couple of years ago, where Heineken really received a lot of bad publishment or publications because it was proven, or people found out, that Heineken treated their beer promoters, which were scarcely dressed women that were employed by Heineken to promote beer, were very badly treated. They were harassed on the job, and they really were working under very poor circumstances. Of course, and this is something, well, might be a bit difficult, in the Netherlands this would have not been possible, or it would have been something that would have received a lot of public attention, negative public attention. However, because this was done in such faraway countries, in Cambodia, in many African countries, Heineken might have thought, well, this is a different country, a different culture, different standard of doing things, so here it actually is allowed to, well, employ these women the way they did and to let them be treated the way they did on the job. I think most of you would agree here that, of course, irrespective of the country that you're working in, you should not be treated in the way, or you should not be sexually harassed while you're working, and also not outside of your job, right? So there is definitely some kind of principle that most of us would agree to that can be used to decide that, well, the treatment of these women is actually morally unjust. But from, again, an ethical relativist point of view, we cannot really conclude that, right? Because there is a different context, and therefore we cannot determine or compare these contexts with each other. So from ethical relativism, we're now going to move to this other perspective on morality, which was called ethical absolutism. So we've discussed, right, the problems with the position that morality is subjective and context dependent, and that also gives us some ammunition to understand why you might need universal principles to decide whether something is right or wrong. And an ethical absolute theory can actually help us to make an argument in such a way, because they believe that there were eternal and universally applicable moral principles. In the first lecture, or the first part of today's lecture, I already introduced two of these ethical absolute theories, the theory of utilitarianism and the ethics of duty, also called the deontological perspective of Kant. And these are two theories that we're now going to discuss into more detail. Part 3 will discuss the theory of utilitarianism, and then we'll end with part 4, in which we're going to discuss ethics of duty. For now, let's take a small break, and then I'll see you back in a couple of minutes.